Before we begin, if you enjoy tales of forgotten lives and the peculiar struggles of history, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more stories that wander through the odd, the overlooked, and the quietly absurd. Now, settle in as we step into the dim, damp corridors of a medieval castle where one of the least glamorous jobs in history awaited its unwilling occupant. Chapter 1. The Royal Rat Problem. The castle stood tall and proud against the horizon, its stone walls gleaming faintly in the sunlight, a monument to power and prestige. Inside, however, the reality was far less dignified. Beneath the grandeur of feasting halls and echoing chambers, beneath the rustling silks of noble skirts and the clinking of goblets, there was another kingdom entirely. It was a kingdom of scurrying feet and twitching whiskers, of sharp teeth gnawing through grain sacks and tiny claws skittering across flagstones. The rats had claimed the castle long before the current lord ever set foot in it, and they showed no signs of surrendering their dominion. This was the Royal Rat Problem, and it was a problem that demanded a solution. Not a glorious one, mind you. Knights could joust, lords could decree, and ladies could embroider. But none of these fine pursuits did a thing to stem the tide of rodents. No, this was a job for someone far less celebrated, the rat-catcher. The rat-catcher was not a beloved figure. He was not invited to feasts, nor was his name recorded in chronicles. He was at best tolerated, a necessary nuisance, like the cesspit cleaner, or the man who shoveled dung from the stables. His existence was acknowledged only when the infestation grew too bold, when rats dared to scamper across the high table during dinner or nest in the lord's best hunting boots. Then, and only then, did anyone remember the rat-catcher. His tools were simple: a knotted sack, a few rusty traps, and, if he was lucky, a half-starved terrier with more enthusiasm than sense. His methods were unglamorous. There was no artistry to it, no clever stratagems, just the grim, repetitive work of hunting creatures that were faster, sneakier, and far more numerous than he would ever be. He would set his traps in the darkest corners, where the shadows smelled of mold and old piss, and he would wait. Sometimes, if the rats were particularly bold, he would chase them with a stick, swinging wildly at shadows as they darted just out of reach, their tiny bodies slipping through cracks. He couldn't even see. The worst part wasn't the work itself, though. It was the way people looked at him. The castle's inhabitants wrinkled their noses when he passed, as if the stench of his occupation clung to him like a second skin. Servants avoided him. Children mocked him, and even the dogs seemed to regard him with a kind of weary resignation. He was the man who dealt with filth, and filth, in the minds of the nobility, was contagious. And yet, without him, the castle would have collapsed into chaos. The rats would have eaten through the winter stores, leaving nothing but husks and droppings. They would have nested in the bedding, their fleas spreading disease faster than any physician could counter. They would have gnawed through parchments, spoiled feasts, and, on particularly bold nights, scampered across sleeping faces, their cold little feet leaving trails of dread in their wake. The rat-catcher knew all this, of course. He knew he was the thin, grimy line between order and pestilence. But no one ever thanked him for it. No one ever clapped him on the back and said, "Well done." Instead, they paid him in lumpy coins and stale bread, and they sent him back to the shadows where he belonged. So it was that the rat-catcher went about his work, day after day, year after year, in a cycle of thankless labor. The castle's rats thrived, and so, in his own miserable way, did he. Because no matter how much the nobility despised him, they needed him. And that, in the end, was the cruelest joke of all. Chapter 2. The job no one wanted. No one became a rat-catcher because they dreamed of it as a boy. There were no wide-eyed children gathered at their grandfather's knee, begging for tales of glorious rodent hunts. No minstrels sang ballads of legendary rat-catchers, their deeds immortalized in verse. The position was not earned through merit or ambition. It was stumbled into, usually by accident, and always with a sinking feeling of resignation. When a castle needed a new rat catcher, the announcement was never made with fanfare. There were no criers in the square, no parchment notices nailed to the church door. Instead, the steward would mutter about it to the cook, who would mention it to the stable hands, who would, in turn, whisper it to the beggars outside the gates. Word spread in the way it always did among the desperate, quietly, urgently, with the understanding that only those truly out of options would even consider it. The hiring process was as grim as the job itself. Candidates were not interviewed so much as they were inspected, like livestock at market. The steward would look them up and down, checking for signs of strength. Would they survive a rat bite? Agility. Could they crawl into tight spaces? And most importantly, a complete lack of other prospects. Would they actually stay? If a man still had all his fingers and a decent pair of boots, he was probably too good for the job. The ideal candidate was just healthy enough to work, but too broken to argue about the pay. Once selected, the new rat catcher was given his tools, or more accurately, the previous rat catcher's tools, usually still crusted with old blood and fur. There was no training. No one explained the best way to corner a nest or how to avoid being bitten where it would fester. Experience was the only teacher, and it was a brutal one. The first week was always the worst. New rat catchers quickly learned that rats were not the docile, slow creatures of barnyards, but sharp-toothed, quick-witted adversaries that fought back when cornered. More than one fresh recruit quit after a particularly nasty bite, clutching a throbbing hand and swearing they'd rather starve. But starvation was, of course, the reason most stayed. The pay was meager, but it was steady, and in a world where steady work was rarer than gold, that counted for something. The rat catcher might not earn enough for meat or ale, but he could afford hard bread and a corner of the stable to sleep in. That was more than many had. And then there were the others, the ones who took the job not out of hunger, but because they had nowhere else to go. The half-mad hermit from the woods, shunned by the village. The disgraced soldier, unfit for battle but too proud to beg. The runaway serf, willing to risk rat bites over returning to his lord's fields. These were the men who lasted longest in the role, not because they were better at it, but because they had already accepted misery as a constant companion. The castle's inhabitants rarely gave much thought to who held the position, so long as the rats stayed out of sight. The rat catcher was as much a part of the scenery as the straw on the floors or the drafts in the hall. Unpleasant, but inevitable. Occasionally a kitchen maid might toss him a scrap if he cleared the pantry of pests, or a guard might grunt in acknowledgement if he disposed of a nest near the barracks. But for the most part, he was ignored, left to his grim work in the shadows. It was a lonely existence, but not a silent one. The rats were always there, scratching in the walls, rustling in the thatch. Their squeaks and scuttles followed him like a second shadow, a constant reminder that no matter how many he caught, there would always be more. He could never win. He could only keep the balance day after day, until his hands were too stiff to set traps or his luck ran out and bite turned sour. And when that happened, the steward would sigh, hand the tools to the next desperate soul, and the cycle would begin again. The castle would never run out of rats, and it would never run out of men willing to catch them. Chapter 3. Tools of the Trade. The rat catcher's equipment was a sorry sight, cobbled together from whatever scraps the castle deemed unworthy of better use. There was no grand armory for this kind of work, no gleaming blades or finely crafted weapons. His tools were the rejects, the forgotten, the broken, much like the man himself. First and foremost were the traps, if they could even be called that. Rusted iron jaws with teeth, dulled by age and misuse, their springs creaking like the groans of old men. They were supposed to snap shut with lethal precision, but more often than not, they either refused to close at all or clamped down with such weak force that the rat could wriggle free, trailing a broken limb behind it. Setting them was an art of frustration. fingers nicked on corroded metal as the rat-catcher muttered curses under his breath. Sometimes, if he was lucky, he'd return to find a carcass waiting for him. More often he'd find the trap sprung and empty, or worse, still set, the bait stolen cleanly by a creature far cleverer than the contraption meant to kill it. Then there were the nets, frayed and patched so many times they resembled spider webs more than tools of the trade. They were meant for scooping up nests or cornering particularly bold intruders, but their holes were always just wide enough for a determined rat to slip through. The rat-catcher would lunge, the net would swish through the air with all the grace of a drunkard's swing, and the rats would scatter, vanishing into the walls with what felt like mocking laughter. The only thing more unreliable than the traps was the dog, if he even had one. The castle's terriers were usually cast-offs, too scrawny for hunting, too ill-tempered for companionship. They were handed to the rat-catcher, not out of any belief in their skill, but because no one else wanted them. A good ratter was worth its weight in gold, but a good ratter never ended up in the hands of the rat-catcher. His dog was more likely to cower at the sight of a mouse than chase it down, assuming it bothered to wake up from its usual spot by the kitchen scraps. On rare occasions one might surprise him with a burst of enthusiasm, snapping at a rodent with more spirit than sense. But then came the inevitable bite, the yelp, and the subsequent refusal to go near another rat for a week. And when all else failed, there was the stick. Just a plain, splintered length of wood, sometimes notched with tally marks from the few rats it had actually managed to dispatch. The rat-catcher would swing it like a scythe, thumping against floorboards and walls, hoping to connect with something soft and furry. It was brutish work, undignified even by his standards, but sometimes it was the only way. The rats knew it too. They would dart just out of reach, their beady eyes glinting in the torchlight, as if they understood the futility of his efforts. The poison was reserved for the worst infestations, the kind that made even the steward clutch his robes in distress. It came in dubious little sacks, the contents smelling of bitter almonds and something far more sinister. The rat-catcher would mix it with whatever scraps he could scrounge. Moldy cheese, rancid fat, stale bread, and leave it in the darkest corners. Then he would wait. The poison didn't kill quickly. It wasn't meant to. The idea was that the rats would stagger off to die in their nests, unseen and unfelt, leaving no mess for the nobility to complain about. But rats weren't fools. They learned fast. After a while they'd avoid the bait altogether, or worse, they'd eat it and then expire in the most inconvenient places possible, like the Lord's favorite boot or the bottom of the grain barrel. Then it was the rat-catcher's job to fish out the bloated corpses, their tiny paws curled in stiff protest. The worst part of it all was the constant improvisation. No 2 days were the same. One morning he might be crawling through the undercroft, his knees grinding into damp stone as he groped for a nest. The next, he'd be balanced precariously on a wobbly stool, swatting at rats in the rafters while the kitchen staff yelled at him to hurry up. There was no technique, no strategy, just trial and error, and far more error than he cared to admit. But the true cruelty of the tools wasn't that they didn't work. It was that they worked just well enough to keep him employed. If they had failed completely, the castle might have invested in something better. If they had succeeded too often, he might have worked himself out of a job. Instead, they lingered in that miserable middle ground, ensuring that the rats never quite disappeared and the rat-catcher never quite gave up. So he carried on, armed with his rusted traps, his threadbare nets, his useless dog, and his stick. He was no master craftsman, no brilliant tactician. He was just a man with bad tools and worse luck, fighting a war he could never win. But as long as the rats kept coming, so would he. Chapter 4. The stench of the job. If there was one thing the rat-catcher could never escape, it was the smell. It clung to him like a second skin, seeped into his clothes, nested in his hair, followed him like a curse no amount of scrubbing could lift. He carried it with him everywhere, the reek of his work, the undeniable proof of what he did. The worst of it was the rats themselves. Not just the living ones with their musky, greasy fur, but the dead ones most of all. A fresh-killed rat had a certain pungency, a metallic tang of blood mixed with the warm, gamey odor of a small creature that had spent its life scurrying through filth. But the ones that had been dead for days, those were the true offenders. Left undiscovered in some forgotten corner, they bloated like overripe fruit, their bellies swelling with gases until the skin split, releasing a stench so thick it felt like a physical presence. The first time the rat-catcher encountered one of these, he had retched until his stomach was empty, tears streaming down his face as the smell coated the back of his throat like rancid oil. By the 100th time, he barely flinched. That was the true horror of it. Not that the smell existed, but that he had grown used to it. Then there were the nests. Rats had a knack for choosing the most foul, inaccessible places to raise their young. Damp corners where the castle stones wept with condensation, clumps of rotting straw in the stables, the thatch of the granary thick with mildew and droppings. The rat-catcher would reach into these dens blindly, his fingers sinking into warmth and wetness, the stink of ammonia and decay rising in a visible haze. The worst were the ones hidden in the walls, where generations of rodents had lived and died, their bones and waste compacted into a reeking paste that oozed out when disturbed. But the rats were only part of the olfactory assault. The castle itself was no pristine monument. It was a living, breathing entity, and like all living things, it excreted. The rushes on the floors were changed infrequently, if at all, and over time they became a sodden mat of spilled ale grease and worse. The kitchens were a miasma of burnt fat and sour milk, the stables a fog of manure and wet hay, the garderobes a choking cloud of human waste that drifted up through the chutes. The rat-catcher's work took him through all of it, crawling on hands and knees through the muck, his nose bombarded from all sides. Even the remedies were foul. When the smell became too much even for the nobility to ignore, the steward would order the floors strewn with herbs, lavender, mint, anything strong enough to mask the rot. But the rat-catcher knew the truth. The herbs didn't eliminate the stench, they just tangled with it, creating new, bizarre combinations. The sweet perfume of rosewater, clashing with the sour tang of vomit. The crispness of rosemary battling the meaty reek of a long-dead rat. It was like listening to two drunkards sing different songs at once, neither pleasant, just loud and wrong. The other servants claimed they could smell him coming long before they saw him. They weren't wrong. No matter how much he washed, and washing was a luxury, given the castle's stinginess with hot water and soap, the odors lingered. The lye might strip the top layer of filth from his skin, but the deeper stink remained, embedded in his pores. The laundresses wrinkled their noses at his clothes, holding them at arm's length as if they might come alive and bite. Even the dogs, creatures not known for their delicate sensibilities, sometimes shied away from him, whining low in their throats as if offended by his very presence. The worst part was knowing that no matter how bad it was for him, it was worse for the rats. Their world was one of constant stench, their noses far more sensitive than his. Every foul corner, every rotting scrap, every drop of spilled wine turning to vinegar, they smelled it all, magnified 100-fold. It was a small consolation, but he took it where he could. At least he wasn't the one living in it. By the end of each day, his head throbbed from the assault, his nostrils raw as if scoured with sand. He would collapse onto his pallet in the stable loft, too exhausted to care that the straw beneath him was musty, or that the air still carried the faint tang of horse sweat and old hay. Sometimes in the quiet dark, he would press his face into the crook of his elbow and inhale deeply, searching for some remnant of his own scent beneath the layers of filth. But it was always gone, buried under the stink of the castle, the stink of the rats, the stink of the job. And so he endured, breathing through his mouth when he could, his nose numb to everything but the worst offenses. The smells never lessened, never faded. They were as much a part of the work as the traps, the nets, the stick. He could no more escape them than he could escape the rats themselves. They were his constant companions, his invisible shackles, the proof that no matter how hard he worked, he would never be clean. Chapter 5. Dangerous Encounters. The rats were the least of the rat-catcher's problems. Oh, they bit often enough. Quick, sharp nips that left angry red marks on fingers and ankles. But any veteran rat-catcher knew the real dangers came from elsewhere. The first time he'd reached blindly into a dark corner and felt needle-like teeth sink into his thumb, he'd howled like a child. By the 100th bite, he barely blinked as he shook the creature loose and crushed its skull against the stones. The true hazards were more insidious. There was the fever that came from bites, not always, but often enough to make every wound suspect. It started with a strange warmth in the joints, then progressed to a fire in the veins that left a man shivering, even in midsummer. The castle physician, when he could be bothered, would peer at the swollen bite, sniff the air nearby, and prescribe leeches or prayer depending on his mood. Neither worked particularly well. Then there were the falls. The job required crawling through spaces never meant for human passage, narrow gaps between walls, rotting floorboards over cellars, rickety ladders to the high rafters where rats nested in the thatch. More than one rat-catcher had met his end, not from fangs, but from a sudden plunge onto unforgiving stone. The current occupant of the position bore a crooked finger and a permanently stiff knee as souvenirs of such mishaps. The rats themselves could turn vicious when cornered. A trapped rat was a desperate creature, capable of launching itself at a man's face with startling speed. The castle's rodents had grown bold over generations, losing much of their natural fear of humans. Some, particularly the large old males with their battle-scarred snouts, seemed to take particular pleasure in the fight. They would stand their ground, hissing and spitting like miniature demons, before darting in to attack. But the most unpredictable danger came from above, not from vermin, but from the castle's human inhabitants. Nobles had a peculiar blindness when it came to servants. They would stride through corridors without seeing the people who scrubbed their floors or emptied their chamber pots, until suddenly they noticed something amiss, a missing brooch, a disturbed document. And then all suspicion fell on the nearest lowborn. The rat-catcher had learned this lesson painfully when Lord Edgar's prized hunting falcon went missing. For 3 days, every servant in the castle had been under scrutiny, but the rat-catcher's inherent suspiciousness, compounded by his perpetual stench, made him a prime target. He'd been dragged before the steward, accused of everything from theft to witchcraft. He talks to the rats. He talks to the rats. I've heard him, claimed one hysterical maid, and only escaped punishment when the bird was found nesting in the bell tower. No apology was offered, of course. Even the castle's other servants could be hazards. Cooks would throw scalding water at him if he lingered too near the kitchens. Guards would accidentally knock him with their spear butts as he passed. The laundresses refused to touch his clothes without holding them at arm's length. Only the other outcasts, the scullery boys, the half-mad old hermit who sharpened knives, the mute girl who cleaned the garderobes, treated him with anything resembling kindness, and even they maintained a careful distance. The worst incident had come last winter, when he'd been called to the Lord's private chambers. A rat had been spotted in the bedchamber, a grave offense against noble sensibilities. Crawling on hands and knees across the expensive rugs, he'd finally cornered the creature behind an ornate chest. In his haste, he'd bumped against a small table, sending a delicate glass vial crashing to the floor. The lady's perfume, imported from the East at great expense, had pooled on the stones, its floral scent mixing horribly with the ever-present castle odors. The beating that followed had left him bedridden for a week, his back striped with bruises. The steward had deducted the cost of the perfume from his already meager wages, ensuring he'd go hungry for months. And of course, the rat had escaped in the commotion. Now he moved through the castle like a shadow, hyper-aware of every potential threat. A noble's approaching footsteps sent him scurrying into alcoves. The sound of raised voices made his shoulders hunch instinctively. Even the rats seemed to mock his caution, sometimes darting across his path in the open corridors where anyone might see. But the greatest danger of all was the one he never spoke about, the slow, creeping understanding that this was his life now. That no matter how many rats he caught, how many bites he endured, how many narrow escapes he survived, he would always be the rat catcher. There was no promotion waiting, no grateful lord ready to reward years of faithful service. There was only the next corner to check, the next nest to clear, the next day of being the man everyone saw but nobody truly noticed. And that realization bit deeper than any rat's teeth ever could. Chapter 6. The Pay. Worse than you think. Payment day was the cruelest joke of all. Every fortnight the rat catcher would shuffle to the steward's chamber, his cap clutched in hand, still bearing the marks of his work. Scratches, bite marks, stains that never quite washed out. The steward would regard him with the same expression one might give a persistent stain on a good tunic, annoyed but resigned to its presence. Then would come the counting out of coins, a ritual performed with all the enthusiasm of a man tossing scraps to a dog he didn't particularly like. The coins themselves were never proper currency. The castle guards got silver pennies. The cooks received a mix of coins that might actually buy something at market. The rat catcher got whatever odd bits of metal had accumulated in the castle's coffers, clipped pennies worn smooth as pebbles, foreign coins of dubious value, sometimes even chunks of hacked-up silver that had to be weighed on scales that always seemed to tip slightly in the steward's favor. And that was when he was paid in coin at all. Often as not, his wages came in the form of goods deemed unsuitable for anyone else. Bread so stale it could chip a tooth. Cheese rinsed with more mold than edible matter. Meat that had begun to turn but wasn't quite rotten enough to throw away, though it would be by the time he got it back to his corner of the stable. Once, memorably, he'd been given a barrel of ale that had gone sour. Still good for cooking, the steward had said with a straight face, ignoring how the stuff had eaten through the barrel's bottom by morning. The worst part wasn't the meagerness of the payment, but the casual contempt with which it was given. The steward would hold the coins between thumb and forefinger, as if afraid of contamination. The kitchen staff would toss his share on the floor rather than hand it to him directly. Even the castle dogs got their scraps from a clean bowl. His were wrapped in leaves and placed just outside the kitchen door where the rain could get at them. There were supposed to be perks, in theory. The right to collect a bounty on particularly large rats. First pick of any unclaimed items found in the walls. Perhaps a warm cloak left behind by some forgetful noble. In practice, these bonuses vanished like mist in sunlight. The rat bounty was always forgotten when he presented his trophies. Anything valuable found in the walls somehow made its way back to the steward before he could claim it. And as for cast-off clothing, well, even the lowliest scullery maid would rather burn a garment than see it on the rat-catcher's back. What little he did accumulate had a way of disappearing. Coins vanished from his pallet when he was out working. Food left unattended was confiscated by guards, claiming it might be stolen. Even his few personal possessions, a slightly less ragged shirt, a wooden bowl that didn't leak, tended to go missing during his absences. When he dared complain, the steward would shrug and say that things had a way of wandering off in a castle, as if this explained everything. The true insult came in winter. When the cold months settled in and rats grew bold with hunger, his work doubled, but his pay remained the same. Noble folk would complain louder about rodents in their chambers, demanding immediate action regardless of weather or hour, yet balked at the idea of paying extra for after-dark service. He once spent an entire night standing guard in a freezing pantry, club in hand, waiting to intercept rats drawn by the stored grain. Come morning, his reward had been a single copper penny, and a muttered about time from the steward. There had been a brief, glorious month when a new steward had taken over, a man from the Low Countries who believed in regular wages and fair treatment for all workers. For 4 weeks, the rat-catcher had known what it was to be paid proper coin on a set day. He'd even been given a new pair of gloves, stiff leather things meant for gardening, but still the finest thing he'd ever owned. Then the old steward had returned from whatever business had called him away, and everything went back to normal. The gloves disappeared within a day. Perhaps the most bitter pill was knowing that for all their complaints, the nobles never actually wanted the rats gone completely. A castle without rats would be a castle that didn't need a rat catcher, and then who would they blame when things went missing? Who would serve as the ever-present reminder of how much worse things could be? The rat catcher understood this truth in his bones. His job wasn't to eliminate the vermin, but to maintain them at just the right level of nuisance. Enough to justify his position, never enough to actually solve the problem. So he endured the paltry payments, the stolen scraps, the constant erosion of his already pitiful existence. He watched as stable boys earned tips for holding nobles' horses, as kitchen maids received gifts of ribbon from visiting merchants, as even the castle fool got occasional coins tossed his way for a particularly good jest. And he continued his work, moving silently through the shadows, catching just enough rats to remain employed, but never enough to make himself obsolete. The coins he did manage to keep, the ones sewn into his mattress, hidden in his shoes, tucked behind loose stones in his corner of the stable. These were his secret rebellion. A few pennies here, a half-coin there, slowly accumulating toward some imagined future where they might buy him freedom. He knew it was a fool's hope. The money would probably be stolen before it amounted to anything. Or he'd die with it still hidden, and some lucky stable hand would find it after they burned his pallet. But the dreaming cost nothing. And in a life where even his pay was an insult, dreams were the one thing they couldn't take from him. Chapter 7. The Social Pariah. The rat catcher moved through the castle like a ghost that everyone pretended not to see, except when they needed someone to blame. Children were pulled aside when he approached, their mothers hissing warnings about the filth man who carried disease in his very shadow. Servants made warding signs behind his back, as if he were some walking ill omen, rather than a man just trying to survive his miserable existence. Even the castle cats, those lazy, overfed creatures who napped by the hearths all day, would arch their backs and hiss when he passed by, as though offended by his mere presence. The superstitions surrounding his profession were as numerous as they were ridiculous. Some believed he could summon rats with a whistle, which explained why infestations never truly disappeared. Others whispered that he spoke to them in their own tongue, forging dark alliances in exchange for secrets stolen from noble chambers. The more creatively paranoid claimed he bred the creatures himself, maintaining the population to ensure his continued employment. Never mind that no sane man would choose such work if given any alternative. In the minds of castle folk, the rat catcher was as much a part of the problem as the vermin he hunted. This reputation made every misfortune his fault. When the baker found rat droppings in the flour, it wasn't because the pantry doors had been left open. Clearly, the rat catcher had been slacking. When the laundress discovered holes in the lord's favorite tunic, she blamed the rat catcher's pets rather than admit she might have scorched the fabric with her iron. After one particularly bold rat ran across the high table during a feast, sending ladies shrieking and lords reaching for their daggers, the rat catcher had been confined to the stocks for 3 days as incentive. No one seemed to notice that the rat problem always worsened during his punishments. Churchmen were the worst. They viewed his work as unclean, a necessary evil that tainted the soul. When he dared attend Mass, standing at the very back, near the door where the draughts were strongest, the priest would fix him with disapproving stares throughout the service. Once, after a particularly virulent bout of fever swept through the castle, the bishop himself had declared that the rat catcher's presence offended God. He'd been barred from services after that, though no one had bothered to tell him directly. He'd simply found the doors barred when he next tried to enter. Even attempts at basic human interaction ended in humiliation. The rare times he gathered courage to join other servants at mealtime, conversations would die the moment he approached. Seats miraculously became occupied. Yokes of ale somehow emptied before they could be passed his way. The few times someone did speak to him, it was always with exaggerated care, as if ordinary words might somehow contaminate them. Market days were a special kind of torment. When he ventured into town to spend his meager wages, Merchants would handle his coins with cloths, tossing them into vinegar bowls after the transaction. The baker's wife made a great show of using tongs to give him his loaf, though she'd happily handle the same bread with bare hands for other customers. Children would follow at a distance, daring each other to touch his shadow before running away squealing. The tavern keeper refused him service entirely, claiming his presence drove away better customers. Ironically, the only people who treated him with anything resembling normalcy were those society had already rejected. The beggars outside the castle gates, the mad old woman who talked to trees, the poacher missing 3 fingers from a sheriff's justice. These outcasts would nod to him in passing, sometimes even share a scrap of food or a gulp of stolen wine. There was an unspoken understanding among them. They were all rats in the castle's walls, just trying to survive in the spaces no one else wanted. The cruelest joke of all was how the nobility treated their actual hunting dogs. Prized creatures with jeweled collars who slept on silk cushions compared to how they treated him. A hound that caught rats would be praised and petted. A man who did the same was reviled. He often wondered if he'd be shown more respect if he crawled on all fours and licked their hands. What stung most wasn't the open contempt, but the quiet betrayals. The way the kitchen maid who sometimes slipped him extra bread would deny it if questioned. How the stable boy who shared gossip with him would pretend not to know him around others. These small kindnesses, given then disavowed, proved more painful than outright hostility. They showed him exactly what his place was, and how careful people had to be about acknowledging his humanity. Worst of all were the rumors that he enjoyed his work, that he took pride in his collection of dead rats, that he kept particularly large specimens as pets, that he slept curled up with them in some dank corner of the castle. These stories grew more elaborate with each telling, until he half believed them himself sometimes. The truth was far simpler and far sadder. The rat catcher didn't love his work. He didn't hate it either. It was simply what he did to survive, like breathing or sleeping. The rats didn't frighten him anymore because nothing could frighten a man who had fallen so low. The smells didn't sicken him because he had long since stopped noticing them. The isolation didn't pain him because he couldn't remember what companionship felt like. He was the castle's living ghost, haunting its corridors by day, disappearing into its walls by night. Necessary but unseen. Useful but unloved. A fixture as permanent as the rats themselves, and just as welcome. And like the rats, he would endure. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Because the world had left him no other choice. Because sometimes survival is the only victory a man can hope for. Chapter 8. Battling Superstitions. The rat catcher knew the moment something was wrong by the way the scullery maid dropped her bucket and fled. Normally she just wrinkled her nose and hurried past, but today she ran as if the devil himself were after her. He soon discovered why. Nailed to the door of the pantry where he kept his traps was a dead crow. Its wings spread in mock flight, a sprig of rowan tied around its neck with red string. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create this grotesque little warning. It wasn't the first such charm he'd encountered. Last winter, he'd found a circle of salt sprinkled outside his sleeping corner in the stable. Before that, someone had hidden a dried toad in his bait sack. Each time, the message was clear. The castle folk believed he brought more than just rats with him. They thought he carried bad luck in his pockets and death in his shadow. The crow was particularly troubling. In the old stories, crows were messengers between worlds, and their dead bodies made powerful charms against evil. That someone had gone to the trouble of killing one meant their fear of him had grown beyond mere disgust. Now they saw him as something supernatural, a walking ill omen that needed warding off. This was the cruel irony of his position. The same people who demanded he rid them of pests believed his very ability to do so marked him as unnatural. Normal men didn't understand rats, they reasoned. Normal men couldn't track them to their nests or handle their squirming bodies without revulsion. Therefore, the rat catcher must be something other than a man. The accusations never came directly, of course. No one dared accuse him outright of witchcraft, not when the castle still needed his services. Instead, they whispered where they thought he couldn't hear. They said he could command rats with a glance, that he never got sick because he'd made a pact with dark forces, that the reason he always knew where to find nests was because the rats told him their secrets. Once, after a particularly successful week where he'd cleared the granary of rats, the miller had refused to let him collect his usual sack of flour. "You've bewitched them," the man had muttered, eyeing the pile of dead rodents. "Made them come when you call, like that piper in the old tale." Never mind that the piper story ended with the theft of children. The miller seemed convinced the rat-catcher had similar powers. The superstitions made his work infinitely harder. Farmers wouldn't sell him herbs for his bait mixtures, fearing they might be used in spells. Servants refused to tell him where they'd spotted rats, as if mentioning them in his presence might summon more. Even the tools of his trade were viewed with suspicion. His traps were too clever for an ordinary man to devise, his knowledge of poisons too precise for someone without dark learning. Things came to a head during the summer fever season. When 3 kitchen maids fell ill with sweating sickness, someone started the rumor that the rat-catcher had cursed them for refusing to give him extra bread. Never mind that the maids had been dumping chamber pots into the same well they drew cooking water from. The rat-catcher's presence in the kitchen earlier that week was evidence enough of his guilt. That night he returned to his pallet to find it burned, his few possessions scattered in the dung heap. No one saw anything, of course. No one ever saw anything when these things happened. The steward gave him a new blanket, thinner than the old one, and smelling of mildew, but refused to hear complaints about who might have destroyed his things. The worst part was how the superstitions crept into his own mind during dark nights. Alone in his corner, listening to the castle's night noises, he sometimes wondered if there wasn't some truth to their fears. Why did rats flee before him sometimes, as if sensing his approach? How did he always know when to check certain areas, as if guided by some unseen hand? In his weaker moments he almost believed he might be cursed. Then dawn would come, and with it the familiar aches of his work, the stink of the castle, the grumbling of his empty stomach. Reality reasserted itself. He was no witch, no demon, no piper of rats. Just a tired, hungry man doing a filthy job no one else wanted. But try telling that to the dead crow nailed to his door. The next morning he found another gift outside his corner, a bundle of sage and garlic tied with black thread. Protection against evil. He left it where it lay. Let them think what they wanted. The rats didn't care about charms or superstitions. They just kept coming, and he just kept catching them. That was the only magic that mattered in the end. Still, that night he slept with his club closer to hand than usual. Not for the rats. For the people who feared him more than vermin. Chapter 9. The Plague Connection. The first sign came when the baker's boy collapsed at the well, his skin burning with fever, dark blooms of bruise-like discoloration spreading beneath his arms. Within days, 3 more servants had taken to their beds with the same symptoms. By the end of the week, whispers of the pestilence slithered through the castle corridors like living things themselves. The rat-catcher knew what was coming before the first accusation flew. He'd seen this pattern before in other towns. The sudden sickness, the panic, and then the inevitable search for someone to blame. That it always fell on his kind was the great cosmic joke of his profession. The very people who spent their lives trying to control vermin were somehow held responsible when disease spread. The castle physician, a pompous man who still believed illness traveled through bad air, made a great show of walking the halls with a scented pomander pressed to his nose. When questioned about the plague's origins, he nodded sagely toward the rat-catcher's usual haunts. "Where there is filth, there is disease," he proclaimed, as if this were some profound revelation rather than an excuse to avoid actual work. Never mind that the rat-catcher had been warning them for years about the nests in the walls. That he'd begged the steward for proper lime to wash down the storage cellars. That he'd shown anyone who would look, which was no one, how the fleas jumped from dead rats to the castle dogs to the servants' bedding. His knowledge, hard-won through years of crawling through filth, counted for nothing now that real danger had arrived. The first direct accusation came from the laundress. "He brings the sickness with him," she shrieked when she saw him checking the linen storage for signs of rats. "Those dead things he carries are poisoning the air." Never mind that her own practice of rinsing plague-stricken bedding in the same tubs as everyone else's clothes might have something to do with the diseases spread. The rat-catcher made a more convenient target. Soon, charms began appearing wherever he worked. Bunches of rosemary nailed over doorways he frequented, crosses chalked on the floors where he walked. The castle priest sprinkled holy water in his path as if exorcising a demon. Even the other outcasts who had once shared silent camaraderie with him now avoided his gaze. Fear had turned them all into enemies. The steward, ever pragmatic in his cruelty, found a way to profit from the situation. He announced that the rat-catcher would now perform his duties only at night, when decent folk were abed. His pay would be halved, of course, since he'd have fewer hours to work, and he must carry a bell to warn people of his approach, like a leper in the scriptures. So the rat-catcher became a creature of darkness, slinking through deserted corridors with his cursed bell clanking at his belt. The sound made his work nearly impossible. Rats fled at the first jingle. But no one cared about results anymore. They only wanted him out of sight, as if by hiding him they could hide from the plague itself. The bitter irony was that this was when they needed him most. With panic ruling the castle, basic sanitation had collapsed. Food waste piled up in corners, chamber pots sat unemptied for days, and the dead rats he did manage to catch were left where they fell, their flea-ridden corpses adding to the danger. Every sensible measure he'd suggested over the years was now impossible to implement, because no one would go near him long enough to listen. The final insult came when the Lord's chaplain declared that the rat-catcher must attend a special purification rite. They stripped him to the waist, scrubbed him with lye that burned his skin raw, and made him swear on a relic that he wasn't in league with the devil. Through it all, the chaplain held a scented cloth over his nose, as if the rat-catcher's very breath might infect him. When it was over, they handed him back his bell and sent him to the kitchens for a meal. His first hot food in days. The cook dropped the bowl on the floor rather than pass it directly to him. As he crouched to gather the spilled stew with his fingers, he noticed something moving in the shadows near the flour bins. A rat, grown bold from neglect, watched him with bright, fearless eyes. For the first time in his miserable life, the rat-catcher considered letting the creatures win. What had his efforts ever earned him except scorn and blame? Why continue fighting a battle everyone insisted on losing? Then he thought of the baker's boy, no older than 12, who had been the first to fall ill. Of the scullery maid who had sometimes slipped him extra bread when no one was looking, now lying feverish in the servants' quarters. However much the castle hated him, there were innocents who didn't deserve to die because of others' stupidity. That night, he worked without the bell. When a guard challenged him, he lied and said it had broken. He set his traps in silence, cleared nests with quiet efficiency, and burned the carcasses in the castle's lime pit rather than leaving them for others to dispose of. If he was damned either way, he might as well do the job properly. As dawn broke, he stood at the castle walls, watching smoke rise from the lime pit where he'd burned the night's catch. Somewhere beneath those stones lay every rat he'd ever caught, every flea-ridden corpse he'd disposed of, every ounce of proof that he'd been right all along. The wind carried the ashes toward town, where new plague cases would surely be emerging by afternoon. They would blame him for that too, of course. They always did. Chapter 10. A Day in the Life. The rat-catcher's day began before dawn, when the castle's night noises gave way to the first uneasy stirrings of morning. He woke curled in his stable corner, knees drawn to his chest against the chill, straw poking through his threadbare blanket like nature's own torture device. Somewhere above him a horse shifted in its sleep, sending a shower of dust down onto his face. This was his alarm. First came the morning inspection of his traps. He moved through the pre-dawn dark with the cautious steps of a man who knew exactly where every loose floorboard and treacherous step lay. The castle might have been a grand affair of soaring arches and sweeping staircases for its noble inhabitants, but for him it was a labyrinth of back passages and service corridors, each with its own particular hazards. The pantry traps were usually the most productive. 3 springs snapped shut overnight, though only 2 still held rats. One had managed to drag itself free, leaving behind a twitching leg and a blood trail that vanished into a crack in the wall. He reset the traps with practiced efficiency, trying not to think about how the escaped rodent was probably currently nursing a grudge against him personally. Breakfast was whatever hadn't been guarded well enough in the kitchens. Today's prize was a heel of stale bread someone had dropped near the chopping block. He gnawed at it while checking the grain stores, where fresh scratch marks in the wood indicated renewed rat activity. The miller caught him examining them and immediately began shouting about contamination, as if the rats had only appeared because the rat catcher had noticed them. Mid-morning brought his daily audience with the steward, a ritual both despised and unavoidable. He stood in the same spot by the door where he always stood, cap in hand, while the steward pretended to consider his report before inevitably dismissing it. Today's suggestion about clearing the thatch in the east wing was met with the usual response. Do what you must, but don't let anyone see you doing it. The actual rat catching began in earnest after noon, when most of the castle was occupied with meals or naps. Today's target was the undercroft beneath the great hall, where the lord's wine was stored. The steward had finally authorized action after a servant reported seeing rats swimming in a barrel of expensive Bordeaux. The undercroft was a special kind of hell, low-ceilinged, airless, and reeking of spilled wine gone vinegary. The rats here were particularly bold, their coats glossy from years of gorging on the castle's finest vintages. They watched him descend the ladder with what he swore was amusement, scattering only when he was fully committed to joining them in the dark. What followed was 2 hours of cramped, sweaty combat. He crawled on bruised knees between barrels, swinging his stick at shadows that always seemed to dart away at the last second. The wine fumes made his head swim. At one point he became convinced one particularly large rat was actually mocking him, pausing just out of reach to groom its whiskers before vanishing into a hole barely wider than his thumb. He emerged victorious with 3 dead rats. Not enough to solve the problem, but enough that the steward couldn't claim he'd done nothing. The wine steward, a much more important person than the regular steward, took one look at the carcasses and immediately blamed him for attracting vermin with your stench. The rats had clearly been there for weeks, but logic rarely survived encounters with nobility. Late afternoon found him in the castle yard, burning the day's catch in the lime pit. This was usually the closest thing he had to a break, since no one bothered him near the foul-smelling smoke. Today, though, a group of kitchen boys decided to amuse themselves by pelting him with pebbles, shouting accusations that he was cooking up spells. He pretended not to notice until one particularly sharp stone drew blood from his ear, at which point he turned and growled like a madman, sending them shrieking back to their mothers. Didn't of us another exercise in creative scavenging. The kitchens were off limits after the wine steward's complaint, so he made do with scraping the leavings from discarded trenchers outside the servants' hall. Tonight's fare consisted of congealed gravy, a chunk of gristly meat of uncertain origin, and half a roasted onion someone had dropped in the rushes. He ate it slowly, making each bite last while watching the sun set over the castle walls. Night brought no rest. With the plague still fresh in everyone's memory, he'd been ordered to conduct after-dark patrols of the food stores. This mostly consisted of sitting in a dark corner with his club, jumping at every rustle, while trying not to fall asleep and miss any actual rats. Tonight's vigil was interrupted by a pair of guards who happened to pass through his area 3 times in an hour, making loud comments about how plague carriers shouldn't be left alone near food. He finally crawled back to his pallet near midnight, too tired to even brush off the worst of the straw. As he drifted off, He realized with grim amusement that the only living creature in the castle that seemed genuinely happy to see him was the one-eyed stable cat who had taken to following him in hopes of stealing his catches. Even that small comfort was ruined when the cat brought him a gift. A still wriggling baby rat dropped directly onto his chest. Somewhere in the distance, a real bell tolled the late hour. The rat catcher closed his eyes, knowing full well the rats would be back at work before dawn, just like he would be. Such was the natural order of things. The castle needed its rats, and it needed someone to blame for them. He was, if nothing else, a necessary part of the ecosystem. As sleep finally claimed him, he found himself wondering idly if the rats held similar discussions about him in their nests. Probably not. They were smarter than that. Chapter 11. The Unseen Competition. The rat catcher wasn't the castle's only predator, and his competitors played by different rules. The castle cats were the worst offenders. Fat, lazy creatures who spent their days dozing by the hearth. They nonetheless received praise and table scraps for the occasional mangled mouse they deigned to catch. Their hunting style consisted of waiting near known rat runs until something slow or stupid enough came along, then batting at it half-heartedly before losing interest. Yet, when the cook found a dead rat in her kitchen, she always credited the cats first, even when the rat catcher's distinctive teeth marks were clearly visible on the trap beside it. The one exception was the scrawny, battle-scarred Tom that haunted the stables. This creature actually earned its keep, though it worked strictly for its own benefit. The rat catcher often found its kills neatly decapitated and arranged in disturbing patterns, as if the cat was either mocking him or attempting some feline form of witchcraft. Their relationship had settled into an uneasy truce. The cat hunted by night, he by day, and neither acknowledged the other's existence directly. Owls presented another challenge. The castle's towers housed a thriving population of barn owls, who considered the rat problem their personal buffet. On quiet nights, the rat catcher would hear their eerie calls echoing through the halls, followed by the occasional scuffle of talons on stone. In theory, he should have welcomed their help. In practice, their hunting grounds overlapped disastrously with his own. More than once he'd set careful traps only to find them tripped by owl feathers. Other times he'd follow promising sounds in the dark, only to come face to face with a furious owl protecting its kill. The birds never attacked him directly, but their disdain was palpable. Then there were the snakes. The castle's old stone walls provided perfect homes for grass snakes seeking warmth. Harmless to humans, they nonetheless sent servants into hysterics whenever spotted, which meant the rat catcher had to remove them along with his usual prey. The irony wasn't lost on him. The snakes were better at catching rats than he was, consuming them whole where he had to make do with crushing their skulls. But try explaining that to a shrieking chambermaid who'd found one in her linen chest. Even insects complicated his work. Fleas jumped from dying rats to his clothing with equal enthusiasm. Baitless chewed through his bait before it could attract anything. Spiders built webs across his carefully placed traps, forcing him to clear them daily lest they provide early warning to his quarry. The castle's ecosystem worked against him at every turn. His most infuriating competitors, though, were the other rat catchers. Not professional ones like himself, but the self-appointed amateurs who decided to take matters into their own hands. The stable boys who set poorly made snares that only taught rats to avoid traps. The kitchen maids who left out poisoned food where any creature might eat it. The guards who thought hacking at rats with their swords was effective pest control, despite inevitably just driving the creatures into harder-to-reach places. These well-meaning idiots caused more problems than they solved. The rat catcher could track a nest's movements by the trail of half-chewed poison bait and mangled rat tails left by these efforts. Every botched attempt at rat control just made the survivors warier, more difficult to catch. But try telling that to some puffed-up knight who thought bashing things with his sword was the solution to everything. The final insult came from the rats themselves. After generations of being hunted, they'd grown wise to his methods. They'd learned to avoid traps, to recognize poisoned bait, to scatter at the sound of his particular footsteps. Some even seemed to taunt him, sitting just out of reach and grooming themselves as if to say, "You'll have to do better than that." The rat catcher sometimes wondered if he was the only one playing fair in this absurd game. The cats had their natural advantages, the owls their flight, the snakes their stealth. Even the rats had numbers and cunning on their side. All he had were his wits, his stick, and a collection of increasingly ineffective traps. Yet somehow, against all odds, he persisted. Day after day he went back to the hunt. Not because he expected to win, but because giving up would mean admitting defeat to creatures that didn't even understand the concept of competition. And that, he decided as he untangled another owl feather from his best trap, was something he simply refused to do. Chapter 12. The Noble's Pet Paradox. The rat-catcher first noticed the absurdity when Lady Eleanor's new lapdog arrived from France. Tiny creature, no larger than a rat but infinitely more spoiled, wore a collar studded with garnets and dined on minced chicken from a silver dish. Its arrival coincided with one of the castle's worst infestations in years, creating a surreal contrast the rat-catcher couldn't ignore. He'd been summoned to the ladies' chambers after one of the castle's actual rats had the audacity to scurry past her prized pet during its evening meal. The dog had yapped hysterically, the lady had screamed, and now he stood ankle-deep in imported rugs, listening to a tirade about vile creatures invading my private quarters, all while the furry parody of a hunting dog trembled in its mistress's arms, tiny tongue licking chicken grease from its jeweled collar. This was far from the only such contradiction. Lord Pembroke kept a dozen falcons in the mews, each worth more than the rat-catcher would earn in a lifetime. The birds dined on fresh-killed quail and had their feathers groomed daily by a team of servants. Meanwhile, the rat-catcher's single mangy terrier, the only creature in the castle more despised than himself, survived on whatever scraps it could scrounge and had to lick its own wounds. The chapel kept a sacred white cat, said to be blessed by the bishop himself. When it deigned to catch a mouse, about once every fortnight, the event was celebrated as a miracle. The monks would ring bells and sing hymns while the cat preened under their attention. Meanwhile, the rat-catcher could present a sack of 20 dead rats to the steward and receive only a grunt and a warning not to track filth on the floors. The cruelest joke was the castle's pet ferret. Lady Isabella kept it in a gilded cage in her solar, feeding it raisins and fresh cream. The creature slept on silk cushions and wore a tiny leather harness studded with pearls. In any other context, a ferret would be the rat-catcher's greatest ally. The long, sinuous bodies were perfect for pursuing rodents into their deepest holes. But this particular specimen had never seen a rat in its life. When the rat-catcher once made the mistake of suggesting the animal might be put to practical use, he'd been banished from the solar for a month. The noble's pets enjoyed privileges beyond anything the human servants could dream of. The dogs slept on beds while scullery maids shivered on stone floors. The falcons received medical attention from a special avian physician, while the castle's children died of summer fever. Even the damn chapel cat had its own designated scribe to record its miraculous hunts in a special ledger. The rat-catcher often wondered what would happen if he tried to explain the reality to these pampered creatures. If he could make them understand that their luxurious lives existed in direct proportion to the misery of others. That every bite of minced chicken meant another rat driven into the servants' quarters. That every pearl in the ferret's harness could have bought enough poison to clear an entire wing of vermin. But the animals weren't the ones who needed convincing. It was their owners who refused to see the connection between their indulgences and the castle's endless rodent problems. The same nobles who complained about rats in the grain stores thought nothing of tossing entire trenchers of uneaten food into the corners for their pets. The ladies who shrieked at the sight of a mouse thought nothing of leaving sweetmeats out where any creature could get at them. The rat-catcher had developed a private theory about why the nobles clung so stubbornly to their useless pets. It wasn't just about status or affection. The pets served as living proof that animals could be controlled, could be made to behave properly. Unlike the rats that defied human order, these creatures knew their place, decorative, obedient, dependent. This was why they hated the rat so much, he suspected. Not because they caused actual harm, but because they refused to play by human rules. They couldn't be bribed with jewels or tamed with sweetmeats. They came and went as they pleased, acknowledging no master. In their own small way, they were freer than the nobles themselves. The rat-catcher found a strange comfort in this thought as he reset his traps in the lady's chamber, careful not to let his shadow fall across the lapdog's velvet cushion. However lowly his position, however miserable his existence, at least he wasn't wearing a garnet collar. At least no one expected him to yap on command or tremble at their feet. He left the chamber with his usual shuffle, pausing only to note the fresh rat droppings near the door. The creatures had been here too, unimpressed by jewels or titles. They'd be back after dark, once the dog was locked safely in its embroidered carrier. Some things, thankfully, remained beyond even a noble's power to control. Chapter 13. The Rare Victory. The rat-catcher knew something was different the moment he woke. The usual morning sounds of grumbling servants and clattering pots had been replaced by an unusual bustle, a frenetic energy that crackled through the castle like lightning before a storm. Then he remembered. Today was the king's visit. Normally such occasions meant nothing to him. The nobles' feasts and celebrations occurred in a world far removed from his own, their laughter and music muffled by stone walls as he went about his grim business. But today was different. Today his presence had been specifically requested. The steward had cornered him the night before, his usual disdain momentarily replaced by something resembling panic. "You will be on hand during the feast," he had said, as if this were a great honor rather than a desperate precaution. "Should any unwelcome creatures appear, you are to deal with them immediately, and silently." It was the closest thing to praise the rat-catcher had ever received. Now, as he lurked in his designated corner near the buttery, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The castle's usual indifference to his work had suddenly transformed into nervous dependence. The cooks had actually given him a proper meal that morning. The steward had grudgingly provided him with a clean-ish tunic. Even the guards, who normally pretended he didn't exist, had nodded to him as he took his position. The great hall was transformed for the occasion. Tapestries hid the worst of the stained walls. Fresh rushes covered the flagstones, their sweet scent almost overpowering the usual castle odors. Servants scurried about like rats, adjusting table settings and lighting extra candles. The rat-catcher watched it all from his shadowed alcove, marveling at how much effort went into pretending the castle wasn't the damp, rodent-infested pile it truly was. The feast began with the usual fanfare. Trumpets, announcements, the king's procession down the center aisle. The rat-catcher had never seen His Majesty before, and was surprised to find him a small, weaselly-looking man, whose elaborate robes seemed to be wearing him rather than the other way around. The nobles fawned over him with the same desperate enthusiasm they showed whenever power entered the room. For the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. The wine flowed, the food piled high, the conversation grew louder and more slurred. The rat-catcher began to relax. Perhaps his services wouldn't be needed after all. Perhaps the rats had decided to show some rare discretion. Then he saw it. A dark shape moving along the edge of the high table, darting from shadow to shadow with practiced ease. It was a big one, too, an old warrior of a rat, its fur grizzled with age, its body thick from years of stealing the castle's finest. It paused beneath the king's own chair, whiskers twitching as it considered the feast spread above it. The rat-catcher held his breath. Maybe it would retreat. Maybe it would. A servant dropped a platter with a clatter that sent the rodent darting straight up the table leg and onto the banquet itself. For a moment, no one noticed. Then Lady Eleanor shrieked loud enough to wake the dead. Chaos erupted. Nobles scrambled back from the table as the rat, now thoroughly panicked, raced across the fine linen, knocking over goblets and trampling delicate pastries underfoot. The king stood so fast his chair toppled backward. Guards drew swords with no clear idea what to do with them. This was the rat-catcher's moment. He moved with a speed born from years of practice, slipping between the panicked nobles with silent efficiency. His tools were simple: a small net, a leather-gloved hand, and the absolute certainty that this was what he'd been born to do. The rat, sensing new danger, made a desperate leap from the table. The rat-catcher caught it mid-air with a swiftness that surprised even himself. One quick twist of his wrist, and it was over. Silence fell. The entire hall stared at him, their faces a mixture of awe and revulsion. He stood there, the dead rat dangling from his grip, acutely aware of how out of place he looked amid the finery. Then the unthinkable happened. The king began to laugh. Not the polite titter of nobility, but a great booming guffaw that filled the hall. "By God," he wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. "Did you see that? Like a damned falcon taking a hare." The tension shattered. Suddenly everyone was laughing, cheering, clapping him on the back, albeit carefully as if he might stain their fine clothes. The steward materialized at his side, actually smiling for once. "His Majesty wishes to reward you," he whispered, as if afraid the words might burn his tongue. The reward turned out to be a silver penny, not from the king's own purse, naturally, but from the castle's funds. Still, it was more than he usually earned in a month. More valuable than the coin, though, was the look the kitchen girls gave him as he passed them afterward. The guards' grudging nods. The way people actually moved aside for him in the corridors, rather than pretending he didn't exist. For 3 glorious days he was almost respectable. The steward stopped short of calling him by name, but the usual insults were noticeably absent. The cook slipped extra meat into his meals. Even the mangy stable cat deigned to rub against his leg once or twice. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the spell broke. On the 4th morning, he woke to find someone had stolen his silver penny. The cook's portions shrank back to their usual meagerness. The steward resumed his customary sneer. Life returned to normal. The rats, never once to miss an opportunity, redoubled their activities now that the extra vigilance had faded. The rat-catcher went back to his thankless work, the brief moment of glory already fading into memory. But sometimes, late at night when the castle was quiet and the rats were bold, he would allow himself a small smile. He had been seen, if only for a moment. He had been, against all odds, almost appreciated. And that, he decided as he reset his traps by candlelight, was a victory no one could take from him. Chapter 14. The Grim Aftermath. The rat-catcher first noticed his own decline when his hands began to shake. Not the usual trembling from hunger or exhaustion, but something deeper, more insidious. It started as a faint quiver when he reached for his traps, barely noticeable unless you'd spent a lifetime handling delicate mechanisms. By the time winter came, his fingers had developed a stubborn stiffness that made resetting springs an exercise in frustration. He tried to hide it, of course. What else could he do? There were no apprentices to pass his knowledge to, no understudies waiting in the wings. The castle employed exactly 1 rat-catcher at a time, and the position only became available when the current occupant died or became too useless to continue. He'd seen it happen to his predecessor, an old man whose cough had grown so persistent the steward finally decided the sound was more annoying than the rats. His body betrayed him in other ways too. The knee he'd injured years ago falling from a rafter now ached constantly, especially in damp weather. His vision wasn't as sharp as it once was, making it harder to spot the subtle signs of rat activity. Even his sense of smell, dull though it was from years of foul odors, seemed less reliable for detecting nests. The castle noticed before he did. The steward began scrutinizing his work more closely, making pointed comments about declining results. The cook, who had once at least pretended sympathy, now openly complained about rat droppings in her pantry. The guards, never particularly kind to begin with, took to calling him grandfather in mocking tones when he passed. He tried to compensate where he could. He worked longer hours, though the night patrols left him exhausted. He doubled his traps, though his aching hands made the work slow. He even experimented with new poison mixtures, though the risk of mishap grew greater with each attempt. None of it mattered. The castle had already begun the quiet process of replacing him. He first saw the boy lurking near the grain stores one evening, a skinny, hollow-eyed youth who watched him with the desperate intensity of a starving dog. At first he thought it was just another kitchen drudge sent to spy on him. Then he noticed how the boy studied his movements, how he noted the placement of each trap. The steward made it official on a bitterly cold morning. "We're taking on an assistant for you," he said, as if this were some great kindness rather than the death sentence it clearly was. "The winter's bound to be hard, and we can't have the work slipping." The unspoken words hung between them. "Oh, way, can't have you slipping. Captain, infestations." The boy, his name was Jankin, though no one used it, shadowed him dutifully for the next few weeks. He learned quickly, too quickly. Within a month, he could set traps nearly as well as the rat catcher himself. Within 2, he'd taken over the night patrols entirely. The rat catcher's world shrank steadily after that. First he lost the night work, then the more physically demanding jobs like clearing nests from the walls. Soon he was relegated to checking the simpler pantry traps, a duty any kitchen boy could have handled. Each reduction came with a corresponding cut in his already meager pay, until he was surviving on little more than table scraps and pity. The final humiliation came when the steward reassigned his pallet in the stable. "The boy needs to be closer to the action," he explained, as if the rat catcher hadn't lived in that same corner for 15 years. His few possessions were moved to a drafty alcove near the garderobes, where the smell made sleep nearly impossible. He saw his replacement flourishing where he had failed. Jankin received praise for catches that would have been expected as routine from him. The kitchen staff actually spoke to the boy, even occasionally by name. The steward, who had never addressed the rat catcher as anything but "you," called the boy lad with something resembling affection. The worst part wasn't even the loneliness, though that gnawed at him constantly. It was the knowledge that this was how it ended for all of them. The old rat catcher had died in a ditch outside the castle walls, his body found frozen one winter morning. The one before that had simply disappeared, presumed drowned in the moat. There were no pensions for men like him, no cozy retirements in some country cottage. There was only the slow, inevitable slide into irrelevance, followed by death in whatever shadowed corner would have him. On particularly dark nights, when the pain in his joints kept him awake, and the sounds of revelry from the great hall drifted through the stones, he wondered why he kept going at all. Pride, perhaps. Spite, certainly. Or maybe just the stubborn refusal to give the castle the satisfaction of seeing him broken completely. So he endured. He checked his few remaining traps with meticulous care, taking absurd pride in each meager catch. He saved what scraps he could, hiding them away against an increasingly uncertain future. And when the boy, his boy now, though neither would ever admit it, came to him with questions, he answered honestly, passing along every trick and technique he'd learned the hard way. Someone had done the same for him once, after all. The world might have forgotten that long ago rat catcher, but he hadn't. And if the boy remembered him half as well, perhaps that would be enough. The rats, at least, still treated him with the same wary respect they always had. They didn't care about stiff joints or fading vision. They only knew he was still dangerous, still to be avoided. For now, that was enough. Chapter 15. The Legacy of the Rat Catcher. No one marked the rat catcher's passing when it finally came. There was no grave, no marker, no solemn procession of mourners. The castle simply woke one morning to find his stiff body curled in his alcove, hands still clenched as if gripping an invisible club, face frozen in its usual expression of weary resignation. The steward sighed, crossed himself half-heartedly, and sent for the boy. By noon, the body was gone, hauled away to the pauper's field beyond the walls. By supper, the alcove had been scrubbed with lye and reassigned to a new scullery maid. By the next morning, the only remaining trace of the rat-catcher was the faint imprint his body had left in the straw, and even that would disappear with time. The boy, now the official rat-catcher, inherited his predecessor's tools, his duties, and eventually his reputation. The same kitchen maids who had once whispered about the old man's supposed witchcraft now made the same signs behind the boy's back. The same nobles who had never learned the first rat-catcher's name would never bother to learn his. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. In the grand chronicles of the castle, where every minor noble's birthday and every inconsequential skirmish was carefully recorded, there appeared no mention of either rat-catcher. Why would there be? They were not knights or lords or even particularly noteworthy servants. They left behind no great works, no stirring deeds, no descendants to carry their names forward. Their entire existence had been defined by absence. The absence of rats, the absence of disease, the absence of complaints from the nobility. Good rat-catchers, like well-built walls or sturdy floors, were noticed only when they failed. Yet in strange ways, their legacy endured. The stable hands passed down stories about the old rat-catcher's uncanny ability to find nests. With each telling, his methods grew more supernatural. He could smell rats through stone walls, they claimed. He could charm them from their holes with whispered words. Some even swore they'd seen him conversing with a particularly large rodent late at night, the two of them sharing some grim understanding between natural enemies. The kitchen staff developed their own superstitions. They hung bundles of herbs where the old rat-catcher had once placed his traps, though none could say why. They avoided stepping on certain stones he had frequently touched, as if they might carry some lingering power. When a new plague swept through the castle years later, more than one servant swore they saw a shadowy figure matching his description walking the halls at night, clubbing invisible rats. The boy, now a man grown bitter with experience, found himself dreaming of his predecessor more often than he'd like to admit. In these dreams, the old rat-catcher never spoke, only pointed to hidden nests or demonstrated some forgotten trapping technique. He'd wake with a start, half convinced he'd actually seen the man's ghost, only to find another dead rat by his pallet, its skull crushed in that distinctive way the old man had favored. Even the rats seemed to remember. For generations after his death, the castle's rodents displayed an unusual wariness of certain spots. The pantry corner where he'd set his first successful trap, the stretch of wall where he'd once cornered an entire nest. New rat-catchers, unaware of the history, would remark on how the creatures seemed to avoid these areas almost superstitiously, as if haunted by some long-dead enemy. Time passed. The castle fell to ruin, then was rebuilt, then fell again. The noble lineages died out or moved on. The very stones were carted away for new constructions. But in the villages that sprang up nearby, strange stories persisted. Tales of a gaunt figure seen prowling ruined cellars, his club always at the ready. Parents warned misbehaving children that the Rat King would come for them if they didn't behave. Old wives prescribed charms made of knotted string and dead rodents' teeth, claiming they carried a rat-catcher's power. No one remembered his name, if he'd ever had one worth knowing. No one recalled the particular curve of his shoulders, or the way he'd limped on wet mornings. But in their own way, they remembered what mattered, that he had existed at all, that someone had stood between them and the darkness, the filth, the creeping things that sought to share their homes. And perhaps in the end that was legacy enough. For every society has its rat-catchers, its unseen guardians who do the work no one wants to acknowledge until it goes undone. They leave no monuments, no portraits, no flattering biographies. They are remembered only in the problems that don't arise, the disasters that don't happen, the pests that never quite take over. The castle's rat catcher would have appreciated the irony. After a lifetime of being noticed only when something went wrong, he was remembered most for what didn't.